Hey everybody, back again to talk some more metal, and today I'm going to be focusing on Carcass, looking at my Carcass albums, and then ranking the full lengths from worst to best. It took me quite a while to come up with this ranking. I just kept these CDs in my rotation and kept changing my mind, but I eventually settled on what I'm about to show you today. So Carcass formed in 1985, and the two mainstays from the band are Jeff Walker on bass and vocals, and Bill Steer on guitar. I mean, respectively, Jeff Walker is one of my favorite death metal vocalists, and Bill Steer might be my favorite death metal guitar player. They formed in Liverpool, England, and in 1996 they would break up following the release of their fifth album. They would reform in 2007, tour quite a bit, and then put out a full length in 2013, and they're still around to this day. So before we rank the albums, I'm just going to take a look at a couple odds and ends I got here. First thing I'm going to look at is this. This is Wake Up and Smell the Carcass. It was released in 1996 on Earache. And this is a compilation of odds and ends. We'll go through that in a minute. That's JFK on the front, apparently. And so what this is the first 5 tracks are all unreleased songs from the Swan Song sessions. There's 4 songs from Radio 1 Rock Show episode, 2 from the Heartwork EP, 3 from the Tools of the Trade EP, 2 from the Pathological compilation, and 1 from the Grind Crusher compilation. So basically all this music, I think, was recorded between about 1991 and 1995. And the order of the songs go from basically newest to oldest. Pretty cool release here, actually. A nice variety. But the track that sticks out the most to me is Edge of Darkness. I got this album not that long ago. And when I first stuck it in, the first song, Edge of Darkness, I heard that on a sampler years ago. But I haven't heard that song in 25 years. And I still remembered every note and kind of blew my mind. But that was, maybe it's just nostalgia, but that was my favorite song on here for sure. Okay, we're going to look at a couple more EPs. Here we have Surgical Remission / Surplus Steel EP. A very similar album cover to Surgical Steel. This came out in 2014 on Nuclear Blast. And this is basically 3 songs from the Surgical Steel sessions. 1 song that ended up being a bonus track on Surgical Steel, that would be Intensive Battery Brooding. And then a reprise of 1985. It closes with that reprise here, which is the first song on Surgical Steel. My favorite song on here is probably the opening one, A Wraith in the Apparatus. Now we have their most recent EP. This is Despicable from 2020. And this came out before the release of Torn Arteries. Another Nuclear Blast album. So this would basically be 3 songs, I assume, from the Torn Arteries session that weren't on the album. And then Under the Scalpel Blade, which would turn up on the actual album. So 1 new song for the next album and 3 unreleased songs. My favorite one on here is, like the last EP, the opener, The Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue. So now we're going to rank the full-length albums. I guess an important thing to note is that Carcass are a pretty fun band to follow through their career, because pretty much every single album is a bridge that connects the album that came before it and the one that comes after it. The progression is there's no drastic changes. You can see the progression slowly going throughout their entire career. And I'm not one of those guys that always tries to put the most recent material at the bottom of the list, but I do think it's appropriate here. My number 7 is Torn Arteries from 2021, their most recent album, and the second after Reforming. Has nothing to do with its place on my list, but I do not like that album cover. It's not that I have a problem with the guys being vegetarians. I just don't really like food art, we'll call it. I've just always been turned off by it. And some of these song titles, Eleanor Rigor Mortis, Kelly's Meat Emporium, Wake Up and Smell the Carcass. I don't know, it's just a little bit too cheeky for me or something. Basically, this is a very professional, slick, but still extreme metal album. It's kind of like they never left, as if Carcass have been making albums all these years, just pumping out competent music. But yeah, it just seems like a mainstream but extreme metal album with Carcassy parts throughout. My favorite 2 songs on here are probably Dance of Ixtab, Under the Scalpel Blade, and The Devil Rides Out. Number 6, Surgical Steel, the first album after Reforming. This came out in 2013 after playing live for many years, and it was released to pretty much universal acclaim. At the time, I also loved it, and I still love it, but I don't like it as much as being there when it came out. My favorite tracks on here are Non-Compliance to ASTM F899 12 Standard and The Granulating Dark Satanic Mills. I've heard many people describe this as a deliberate merging of their probably 2 most successful albums, Necroticism and Heartwork. Don't know if I quite hear that though. It's, again, like Torn Arteries, it is the Carcass you know and love, but again, very slick, professional, and maybe lacking a bit of the charm of the past. I should note that while supporting Surgical Steel, I saw Carcass live for the first and so far only time live. That was the Decibel tour that they were headlining. I went with a bunch of guys from work. I was a big Carcass fan. One of my coworkers was a big fan of Gorguts, who played. Another coworker was a fan of Black Dahlia Murder, who were on there. And then I think Noisem were the first band. And great show. It was, Carcass's stage setup. They were all in a medical get-up with a white background. Just the whole stage was white and gray. I thought it looked pretty cool. And it was a great show. Number 5, 1995's Swan Song. I should mention that the first 5 albums, ending with this one, were all put out on Earache, and they've been on Nuclear Blast since Reforming. So Swan Song, 1995. This album was regarded as a huge sellout, and while I did see some positive reviews at the time, most people didn't like it. And I saw that firsthand when I got this used just months after it being released. So some old school Carcass fan definitely bought it, didn't like it right away. But I did buy it. I was like 12 years old, and for years, the most immediate songs on here were the ones I always skipped to. Keep on Rotting in the Free World, Rock the Vote, and Go to Hell. They're all very catchy, immediate songs. And the rest I just kind of regarded as filler. But Overall, I'd say each one of these songs, they always win me over in the end, a lot better than I remember it being. I'd say tracks 8 and 9, Generation Hexed and Firm Hand, are my least favorite, but they're okay. Uh, this album really brought back a lot of memories. The guitar work's probably the highlight here. And in hindsight, I hear a lot of 90s In Flames on here. But I would actually have to say that Swan Song might have, I'm pretty sure it did predate most of those In Flames releases. So very influential and a very underrated album. Number 4, this might be low for some people, but again, just my sentimental picks. Symphonies of Sickness. This came out in 1989, their second full length. Still a gore grind band, but longer songs, more variety, more spice, and many a fan's favorite album. The vocals are much less extreme, and I think that's to its detriment. I think one of Reek's most distinguishing qualities is the vocals. I just personally like the albums that came before and after this better. My 2 favorite tracks are Ruptured in Purulence and Swarming Vulgar Mass of Infected Virulency. Number 3, another fan favorite, Heartwork. This came out in 1993, and it's probably their most popular and best-selling release. Not this edition here, but part of the reason for that is that this was, at the time, in 1993, co-release between Earache and Columbia, the major label. So that whole Earache Columbia thing, you guys all know about that already, but that was perhaps my first exposures to death metal. I remember reading Hit Parader magazine, trying to get info on Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, and Metallica, and just seeing those ads, Wolverine Blues, Heartwork, Godflesh Pure, Ethereal Mirror by Cathedral. All that stuff was my first exposure to death metal, along with Ace Ventura and Cannibal Corpse around the same time. So this album, in a way, is kind of perfect, but my personal opinion, it ends kind of weak. Tracks 8, 9, and 10 aren't that good to me, but anyone giving this album 10 out of 10, I totally see where they're coming from. My personal favorites are 4, Heartwork, and This Mortal Coil. They had 2 videos that were on back in the day. I used to watch those on Power 30, Loud, whatever it was. Those were No Love Lost and the aforementioned title track, Heartwork. Another thing, too, is the same way I said when listening to Swan Song, I'm hearing a lot of 90s era In Flames. I found myself thinking late 80s, early 90s Creator. That's what I was thinking. Number 2, Necroticism. This came out in 1991. This was when they began to leave behind their gore grind roots and became more of a standard death metal band. I still say they had a firm foot in the past, but not accessible in the same way that Heartwork would be a couple years later. Favorite tracks are probably Carcass, Cacophony, and Lavaging Exploitative of Lysergied Composition, but who could forget the fan favorite tracks of Incarnated, Solvent Abuse, and Tools of a Trade. So that leaves my number 1 with the debut album, Reek of Putrefaction, Not trying to have a hot take here. It's just the album that I play the most. This is not the original album cover. The original album cover is much more graphic than this. This CD is pretty old, but upon closer inspection, it is a 1994 release of an album that came out in, I believe it was 1987. Lots of great tracks on here. Carbonized eye sockets, vomited anal tract, suppuration, burnt to a crisp, pungent excruciation. I love the vocals, which would not really be heard from, again, a much more guttural thing, which isn't really my kind of thing in death metal, but again, I love Jeff Walker's vocal style. And, again, these were the most brutal vocals he ever did, but throughout his career, a lot of times he just sounded like a big snake. It was kind of unique. And both musically and vocally, I hear a lot of things that would go on to influence what's now known as war metal. When I go back and listen to this, it always kind of takes me aback how much it has in common with it. And extremely influential album, and definitely the best gore grind album of all time. So that's it for Carcass. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.